Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Opt-In. I am beyond excited for our guest that's here today. A very funny story. I belong to an organization called Chief, which I've talked about a ton on this show. I did an all call for some help. And as the Chiefs do, they rallied en masse. And I got to meet today's guest through what I would consider kind of normal business channels. She thought she could help me solve a business problem. So we literally hopped on a Zoom call and chatted through it and made an instant connection. And I think before we ended that meeting, I asked her if she would be on the podcast. So we literally connected right away. So our guest today is Urvashi. She is a Yale University graduate and also holds a Doctorate of Physical Therapy from Boston University. So just incredibly impressive on the academia front. And then also she's the co-author of the Sustainability Scorecard and is a healthcare executive whose career spans clinical care, research, and clinical instruction in physical medicine and rehabilitation. That's not all, though. It also spans advocacy and strategy and operations consulting for leading healthcare organizations. I'm still not done. To round it all out, she is a mom to one right now and has a second baby on the way. And I'm telling you, this is just the very beginning of all of her major accomplishments in her story. I'm so excited to have her here today. She's going to talk to us about how she pivoted her career and whatever else we get up to in the conversation. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. I definitely need to edit my intro. You just made me realize maybe I shouldn't put everything in there.
I think the more we can speak about all of our achievements. You go to those big conferences and other people get up on stage and they're like, here's my entire laundry list and a PowerPoint slide of what I do. So I think scream it from the rooftops. You worked hard to get those.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes.
So while we've kind of described what you've achieved and where you are today, what I didn't cover was the very beginning. So one of the first things that I learned about you is that you are an immigrant to the U.S.
Yes.
So you want to talk a little bit about that journey? Where did it all start? Why did you even want to come to this amazing country to begin with?
Yeah, I love the United States, but I came here when I was a kid. I had an accident aboard a ship because my dad worked in the Merchant Marine, and I was just a very curious child. I had to explore every nook and cranny where motors and other navigation equipment existed. So obviously not a strong choice. I had a minor accident, and I was airlifted to the U.S., and that was my first brush with the U.S. Healthcare specifically. I had a number of surgeries and physical therapy. But interestingly, and I think I've shared this with clients sometimes when they ask about, what makes me so passionate about healthcare, I think it's that at a very young age, I became very well acquainted with the whole ecosystem. I just sort of instantly understood that it's not just your PCP or your specialist or the care team that they're surrounded by. It's also the insurance and legal and a multitude of factors, not to mention your social and environmental determinants of health that determine your ultimate outcome and are less often talked about, but are just far more strong predictors of your outcomes than your one-time visits with your doctors. So anyway, spent my formative years here, went back to India, and I did my high school and undergraduate education there. And I was really inspired to apply for jobs in the US and ended up getting my second job in physical therapy in my life here. And I was really excited because I already had a career in international public health and physical rehab. And I had seen it from the standpoint of a developing nation. And, in India, specifically, I worked with like the tuberculosis and the post-polio syndrome population. And these are diseases that were eradicated from the rest of the world much faster than they were in Asia. And of course, I'm aging myself, but before polio was eradicated, I was still working on it. And it was an amazing experience. It was the first time I was confronted with health equity issues, social and environmental health determinants, And they sort of, at the very beginning of my career, became so important. They were not something that I just intuitively understood. They were also just very much factors that we addressed when we were administrating care or providing referrals and things like that. So when I came to the US, I was really excited to see how care is different and if there was a greater impact to be had by way of all of this amazing research and innovation that occurs here. So that's the long story of how I came to the US twice.
Twice, many times over. And you started when you came to the US, you were a clinical practitioner, right? You were seeing clients, you were practicing the science of physical therapy. So how long did you do that before you started thinking that you might want to try something different?
Yeah. I think I may have always thought that I couldn't imagine that doing one thing forever was all that I would ever do. Mm-hmm. I just didn't. And I also wasn't okay with just dropping physical therapy as my profession. I knew that I wanted to be involved in healthcare in some way. I didn't want to let anything go. I enjoyed patient care. I enjoyed talking to people and addressing their multitude of issues that impact their outcomes. But I wanted other channels and other ways to impact the healthcare ecosystem at large. And also, I wanted to affect the way the healthcare system interacts with other parts of the economy, which I think when I said that early on in my career, people looked at me like I had three heads. Like they just couldn't. Well, I mean, it's like people are like, oh, well, cardiology, that department is there. Healthcare is very much a silo. So different departments are their own ecosystems, have their own research, and you name it. I mean, it's a very siloed world. So when I would say I want to understand the interaction, affect the interaction, not only between like them, but also like the healthcare system and the rest of the economy, that was just, I don't know how to help you. I don't know how to guide you. Good luck. And
probably a little bit of like, you've got a good job. What are you thinking? Like, You're fine. You went to school for all this time to get here. And like, what are you doing thinking you need to create this new mission for yourself? I'm sure there's a bit of that too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's also about debt, right? You've incurred all this debt. You've spent all this time studying while our peers. And of course, if you go on to become a surgeon or a medical doctor or something like that, I mean, all of these different tracks have extended study attached to them. So once you finally arrive at the end of it, people are like, well, just like my parents would say, just go ahead and earn some money first. Just, pay rent.
Take care of yourself.
Right. Right. So yes, those were definitely very immediate concerns. But I think I always kept exploring. I didn't know what it would look like at the end of the day. I couldn't imagine what my life would be like in my 30s or my late 30s right now. But I just knew that I had to add other tangents and other facets to my career. It couldn't be just one thing. And it wasn't about physical therapy. It just couldn't be one thing. So, yeah.
So as you started asking yourself these questions, right, they start bubbling up. I want to do more. I want to do different. Everybody is saying good luck, but not giving me any breadcrumbs on how to do things. Where did you start? How did you start to chart your course to pivot from where you were?
Yeah. There's a lot more out there on this subject now on pivoting. But when I was at the beginning of my career, like, first of all, the only social media around was Facebook. So there wasn't a whole lot out there. And so I don't think I was very intentional about it. I think I was just trying everything. I was exploring. And so I initially started by trying to get to know my own world a little bit better. So I decided that I would support my upper management and I would get into management. And at that time, and now this is less common. Now there are clinical providers that are like, for example, physician executives and things like that. So they still hold office hours and appointment hours, and they're still able to do treatment and research and things like that all in parallel track. But at the time, people would say, oh, you're really choosing one or the other. And I kept thinking, well, I don't know. Let's see how this turns out. I mean, I think I'm valuable as a clinical provider, but I'm also valuable in data analytics and in management and in, automation of our EMR and all of these kind of issues that our firm was facing. So I started out by getting involved in smaller projects that created operational efficiencies. And in parallel track, I would attend conferences, which, by the way, I paid for myself. I would go to with no agenda. I had nobody supporting me. Nobody was saying, hey, you're my mentee, and the grand
Let me show
plan,
you the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you want to pivot your career, then what you do is you go to the EPIC conference and you get to know none of that. I just went to conferences in the DC area to learn more about what other providers were doing, and how they were addressing these core challenges. So it really started with me understanding my own little ecosystem, and over time, I realized that a lot of the things that I was solving for are the same things that PwC and EY and McKinsey and all of these larger organizations are helping their clients solve for. And so I spent about 7 or 8 years in clinical care, which also included research, getting my doctorate, everything. And somehow I ended up, because I had, I think, spent enough time with my one employer, that I had built up the trust and goodwill that they said, if you can handle it, and if the quality of your work is good, and that means patient care, we have no risks, we have, patients that are meeting their outcomes and that kind of thing, you can do whatever you want. And so and so I actually, I now look back and I think, wow, I should have negotiated like a far better salary for myself. I was probably doing 2 or 3 people's jobs at once, but at the time I was just grateful for the opportunity. So I would have clinic hours, but I would also be involved with, addressing larger clinic issues like expanding our clinics in the DC area, market penetration, things that we call now market penetration and branding, and preventative care. So I started this preventative care movement within my company, where we would basically hold races. So we were doing awareness regarding osteoarthritis and all kinds of things, basically all bone health related. And to raise awareness for that, we would do like quarterly races, and celebrate the fact that our patients were able to complete whatever milestone they had set for themselves in that race. And so it started out with these little things. And one day I got the bright idea that I would apply to business school, and the debt issue became a big topic of conversation. My husband was like, "Oh, it's pretty expensive, and we don't know what this career pivot would look like for you. Although obviously you have a credible, resume, I suppose, to go off of now." But my parents weren't thrilled about the cost of the program either. So I intentionally applied to, I intentionally thought I would apply to like 4 or 5 programs. And I applied to Yale because I thought I would get rejected first. They would be a fast no. And so I wrote out everything and I sent it to them. I had an interview on Thursday. They called me on Friday afternoon and said, well, you're admitted. And so would you like to, we'll send you the formal letter and everything. And I thought, okay, now we have to figure out how to pay for this.
Now this is real and it's Yale and I'm not going to say no. So what do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really where it quote unquote took off, but it took off in the sense that I was surrounded for the first time in my life by amazing mentors and amazing thought leaders and people that could actually provide me a crystallized vision of the future, whatever that might be. And if you didn't want a siloed path in one thing, then what does a big picture career look like? Is it in consulting, you can help a variety of clients or whatever it is? There were thought leaders that came at business and business in healthcare or just economics broadly from just so many angles. And I just view my time at Yale as transformational.
So you started your career and you just became curious, right? You like
Mm-hmm.
had this little bit of like a restless, like, this isn't it. This isn't all the things. I don't want to do this for the next 40 years and just like tread water the way everybody expects you to. And so you got really curious. And then you said something as you were talking about those early years that your curiosity parlayed itself into getting a door kind of open to do what you want, as long as your work doesn't suffer over here, but also do some work for us for free that if it
Yeah.
pans out is really going to benefit the organization. So looking back on that and understanding that like it definitely was a learning experience for you and you didn't have a lot of structure or mentors kind of guiding the way, would you give anybody any advice right now that's in kind of that very first season where they're in the job that they wanted and they're just like, it's not, there's something else here, and they start getting curious, and then their boss starts saying, well, sure, you can take on that extra whatever. Like, could you give some advice to people how, like, maybe hindsight being 2020, how you would have navigated that with what you know now?
Absolutely. I think when I look back, someone said to me once that the greatest opportunities are the ones that you don't anticipate. And I would say to myself, when if I could kind of give myself advice at that time, I would tell myself to pay attention a little bit more to those opportunities, and be a little bit more strategic about them. And what I mean by that is that they're all equally important, and they're all going to teach you something at the end of the day. Not all of them may make themselves into your career when you're in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s, but at the end of the day, they're all going to inform what you do in the next step in some way. And knowledge never goes wasted. And so I mean, I almost look back and wish that I had created more networks at that time intentionally. Like if I was working on EMR automation or finance transformation, or analyzing large subsets of data to understand where is our, where are biggest risks in our patient population and which interventions would best work. I wish I would think a little bit more strategically and think, well, does Innova, a health system in DC, have data on this, and how are they addressing it? And can I reach out to someone over there who might be able to provide some thought leadership, or can I reach out to larger organizations that for whom we probably wouldn't even qualify as a client, but they would have leading best practices that they could share with me, and I would learn, and I'd be able to really credibly apply something the first time, as opposed to failing fast enough, which is also wonderful, but there are more resources available to you now. And so I would encourage myself and others to pay a little bit more attention to those opportunities and approach them a little bit more strategically, and try to involve your network in them, because it's a low risk way for them to get involved in your career. It's not that they're, sponsoring your next promotion. They're not providing you a recommendation that's going to be durable for the next role or whatever it is. They're lending their expertise. From their standpoint, it's mentorship and education. You're really learning something, and you're getting something extremely valuable from them, which is their expertise and their knowledge, and you're applying it to your project, which could ultimately be really something.
That's such good advice. I say often when people ask for me to tell my story that I got here by accident, because I did get here by accident. And when I look back, I think about all of those missed opportunities that I had to make connection or to foster a relationship, or, just get really creative with the process as you go. And, as soon as an opportunity is presented to you, whether you're going to get additional pay for it or not, but you can see some benefit or some excitement in doing it, one of the things that you advise, and I fully endorse, is just take a beat, just take a minute and say, what's the best way to go about this? And who can I connect with that also might have knowledge or expertise or passion or whatever on the topic? And really use that as a way to A, solve whatever problem you're trying to solve, but B, to position yourself in a broader landscape where you're just kind of creating this patchwork quilt, so to speak, of experience and knowledge. And you know that if you have a similar problem in the future, here's my extended bench that I can go to. I mean, how amazing is it if you go apply for a job in 5 years and somebody says, this is your first assignment in your interview, and you could say, well, that's great because I know a person here and a person here and a person here, so I can just tap into all of that, and I've done it before, and you have evidence that you've done it. It's those sorts of seasoned moments of expertise really start to help you move the needle professionally, I think, in the long run.
I totally agree with you. And that exactly came to life for me. Like, I actually ended up moving on to Big Four firms, and I found myself calling friends and acquaintances and advisors that I'd met in the past to ask, hey, you had mentioned something to me 3 years ago, and I know we were involved in a certain project together. Could you advise me now? I really need to get something done in a week, and, would love your expertise. And they were more than happy to help. And I was able to ask better questions because I had leveraged their expertise before. We had built up trust. This wasn't a first time conversation. It didn't require a 3-week runway. I love that advice.
Yeah, I think it's, and there's a level of comfort. So as even if you only touch that relationship once every 5 years or whatever it might be, it's a little bit of a safer place for you to go be inquisitive or vulnerable because you don't have the answers or know really who to connect with next.
Yeah.
And it's such a good way to augment what you may not be getting internally in your environment, because, in the end, we're all limited to what we've experienced and what we've learned, and we can't be all things to all people, right?
Exactly. And also, I think I've learned, at least for myself so far, that I haven't, at least for myself, found one role that fulfills all of my interests. And so it allows me to engage with different people with expertise in different areas that I'm really excited about, but it just has not made its way into a core profession for me yet. And so it's a way to keep those interests alive. It's a way to do something more credible in those areas that actually benefits others and actually becomes, even if not part of your core profession, but actually becomes creates a real impact in the world to further something, whether it's furthering research or furthering, a startup that does something in the future, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And so you started as a clinician, you had a very kind of mission focus, like these are the problems I want to interrogate and figure out solutions for, and like how can we be better in this space? And then you're like, the next right step is to go to business school. Hey, hey Yale, sure, I'll come in and join you. And then as your years kind of came to a close at Yale, you decided not to go back to clinical work, and you decided to take yet another kind of diverging path. So how did you make the decision on what to do after your time at Yale was over?
It's a good question. I would say it was a journey. I continued to work throughout my business school, and a part of it was need-based. But the other part of it was that I was really inspired by my classmates. I mean, they were incredible. They were leading things in other organizations. I was learning about parts of the economy that I didn't know existed, and what they did and their impact, and started looking at retail health back then. And of course, now that's a big deal and we have all kinds of mergers. But at that time I was thinking, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if there was like a whole PCP clinic in a Walgreens? That would be amazing. And so, yeah, I got really interested in those areas, and I almost had FOMO. Like, I was afraid that I would graduate and I would have to start the pivot then versus start it now. Like, I wanted to make the mistakes while I had this whole ecosystem around me to advise me. So it was a little challenging in terms of timelines and when my classes would occur and if I had deliverables and that kind of thing. But I worked in firms. I did everything from home health, physical therapy, which provided me insight into an area of not only physical therapy, but healthcare that I just didn't have insight into before, and did hospice, which was another really fascinating and emotionally challenging area to work in, to data analytics and population health, and looking at basically leveraging all of your R and all of these computer languages to look at patient subsets from the highest level to understand risk profiles, and almost look at it from the side of a payer to understand when certain patient populations might experience an adverse event and how can we prevent it, like which interventions will work, and is there anything we can do from a behavioral standpoint to affect this patient population so that they don't meet that eventual outcome. So I mean, all of these things were transformational. And then I went from that to, I mean, they all presented themselves with the next so what question at the end of the day. Like I went from, healthcare to analytics, and then at the end of the analytics projects, I would think, well, I mean, I wish I was really providing the strategy. I actually have the expertise, and I've actually done patient care. I wish I could inform them about the strategies that are going to work on the ground. And so I think it was at the end of my analytics work that I decided that I think the right next step is consulting, and I was probably the only mission-driven consulting applicant.
100%, and probably to this day are the only mission-driven consultant applicant in the US, for sure.
Indeed. And I would go to these interviews where the first thing people would say is, well, we have this great benefits package, and we have this, and we have that, and you know what, for working moms, we have all of these things, and I would just be really focused on who are your clients in healthcare, and do you have an eye on the retail health market, and what are you? I'm such a nerd. But that was really all I cared about.
That was your priority. Yeah. What kind of work am I going to do? What kind of change am I going to influence? Like, I want to know what you're actually doing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was a little bit more surgical about it. Like, I thought, and I don't know if this is right for everybody, but I thought, look, if I can meet my expenses, I'll do anything. I mean, this is an opportunity to really, really accelerate my career. That's great that these firms pay a lot. Money's always helpful, but it wasn't what I was going for, because I would have probably worked for a lot less just to work with those clients. And it's a good thing they didn't know that. And and that's how that journey started.
Yeah. So it's so fascinating. So you go into this world as a mission-driven individual. And for those listening to this podcast that are not familiar with the consulting work, it's kind of eat or be eaten, kind of an environment. Depending on the firm that you're in, some of them have practices of 3 years and up or out, which means if you don't achieve the next rank, whatever that is in the company after 3 years, then they work on getting you out of the company because you're not following the script. There's all sorts of things depending on the roles that you're in with bringing in sales and clients. And when the contract is over, it just means you need to go get another contract with them. And, so you're kind of in this very capitalistic, revenue generating environment. And your primary goal is service and mission and these really important social topics that, frankly, not a lot of people are talking about on a daily basis. So how did you balance the culture of the firms that you were in with what your priorities are for the type of work and the type of impact that you were having on the industry and the world as a whole?
I embraced it. I think I navigated both of those worlds by quantifying the value of the missed opportunity. And I ended up becoming, in my last year at my previous firm, I was like one of the top 10 performers in terms of like business development and that kind of thing. And that was the year I remember I really I think I really honed in on quantifying that missed opportunity. And that was at the time when we had, like in healthcare, we just started talking about like social determinants of health had finally become a buzzword. And I thought, this is the wake up call that the world needs. And so we started applying that to a lot of areas, whether it was clinical research organizations or anywhere. We started looking at what would traditionally be considered a soft skill or a qualitative, but untapped area within an organization, let me give you an example, like patient education and patient awareness, which, by the way, like still doesn't have a really good business model around it. But I just thought it was a fascinating and extremely valuable intellectual exercise to develop a net new business model behind something that doesn't have a business model yet. And I just thought that here we are in the 2020s, or almost to the 2020s, and like we haven't figured this out. There's a thing that the collective we hasn't done yet, and I get to do that with these people. And so, I mean, I think that there's a way usually to merge two worlds, and quantifying things is the way that I've found to be really effective in merging those two worlds. And I did that again in my book with ESG, because I just found that the way ESG is addressed or practiced just doesn't, it's not comprehensive. And also, I don't think we've fully quantified the impact. We haven't looked to the future to say what's going to be really important in the next 50 to 100 years. And so what should we be investing in now so that we can actually, well, affect change, but we can like really, really make money off of that change in the future. So the whole premise behind my book was the next set of high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals are going to be those people that either create products or they invest in climate change. And so I started another fun intellectual exercise where I was thinking, how would I put a business model around this? How would I quantify this? There's so much data on like the heavy metals or the material science industry and that kind of thing, but nobody's quantified what the green chemicals are worth out of this entire subset. We know what endocrine disrupting chemicals are worth because we eat all of them every single day. But what about this subset, and if I inject this subset with cash, how much can I make that blow up? So, I recommend embracing the quantification. It is work, at least it is work for me.
Yeah, so I think what your advice is really sound, because kind of breaking it down into it can apply anywhere. It's knowing your audience to a certain extent. So you came in and you got into the room and then you said, well, how do they make decisions? What's important to them? What language are they speaking? Are they speaking a language of data? Are they speaking a language of client narrative? So they really focused around, client experience in the narrative. Are they looking through an internal lens, which is really all about, profit, gross margin, all of those things? Like what's happening here? How are we making decisions? How are things getting a yes? And how is that being determined versus a no? And then you were able to take, well, these things I think are really important. So how can I take these topics, these strategies, these projects, these, whatever they are, and pitch them in the language that they understand and resonates with them and gets them closer to a yes than a no? How can I leverage the language and the way that they talk and the way that they think and the decision making that's in place through the lens of what I want to have happen so that I can see the outcome that I want? I think it's an incredibly creative way that requires a lot of observation and patience, probably. I'm sure you have a lot of stories about how you'd be a little bit patient as you were going through, but so effective because you're very much focused around the change that you can see kind of from this large strategic vision and an understanding of what's most important to them, and being able to pair those things together so that everybody wins or has a perception of a win in the situation. I think that anybody at any level of an organization, if they have that much awareness, can really affect a lot of change.
I totally agree with you. And the good news with all of this is that we have all of this knowledge with us. It's all been done before. This stuff has been perfected. One of my good friends now, but professors when I was in business school, Zoe Chance, wrote this incredible book, Influence is Your Superpower. And it's all about her insights on negotiation, but it takes it a step further to say, well, negotiation is good, and I'm glad that we're bartering things across the table, but we really want to be able to influence more people than the one individual that's sitting across from us. We want to influence the entire organization and their shareholders and all the consumers. And so what are the best known strategies to do that? And she goes through this in such fine detail. Um, it's really heartening for someone at the beginning of their career to know now that there's so much about the business world and economics and human behavior that is known now. It just needs to be applied in different ways.
Yeah. And I think, as you kind of explore that, and that I'm going to have to get her book and see what she has to say. I'm excited to read it now. Understanding how to influence means that every human that you're interacting with requires a different approach and a different messaging strategy. And, one will be concerned about data, and the other one will be, very drawn to emotional and compelling communication. And it requires a lot of awareness. We haven't heard, I think, in a long time, anybody stand up on a stage and start talking about the EQ, or the emotional quotient. I mean, that was a very big thing like 15 years ago, probably. And everybody was trying to measure it and like, forget IQ, it's EQ that's important. But I think that this plays into that space a little bit. It's a little bit of that, adage of being able to read the room, but it's almost more sophisticated and nuanced than that, because you really have to spend time, tying back to how we were talking about building the network, of having relationships and understanding the inner workings so that you can adjust and ebb and flow as you're going through to really drive the decisions forward that you're looking to drive, or the priorities that you want.
Absolutely, 100%. And yeah, it's all about keeping the big picture in mind and quantifying it and understanding what you're going for and who is your customer at the time, and who is your ally, and how they want to be messaged and what's going to resonate with them versus somebody else. And also, I think another thing that also is very exciting these days is the power of social media and what we see it doing, what we see consumers worldwide doing, which is creating like whole market shifts and creating new markets. And so it creates a space where you can actually meet a demand that probably already exists, but it just doesn't have a solution for it yet. Or you can create your own demand and channel all of those people to that, so either product or process or whatever it is that you're working on.
So as you're in the consulting firm, you've moved on from them now, and you're in a new organization, but mission is still just a part of your DNA. It's just what it is. We've got a book out there. We've got all of these things. So what's currently on your plate? What's that like? This is the thing. This is the change I'm going to inject into the world. This is what I'm chasing right now. What's your big mission you're chasing?
I think I've become a little bit more comfortable than I was earlier in my career with ambiguity. And I know we talk about that all the time, or at least in consulting, we talk about ambiguity all the time, and becoming comfortable with it. You don't know whether someone's going to become your next client. Will that happen now? Will that happen in 10 years because they kept you in mind? Or, I mean, whatever it might be. But I'm really starting to think about the intersection between healthcare and the rest of the economy, and trying to figure out ways, whether it's a business model or an investment solution, that can really affect healthcare through everything. Like, why can't everything from my tea to the products that I use on a daily basis, like skincare or whatever it is, why can't all of this stuff be more directly involved in healthcare, whether that's through partnerships or whether that's through an investment vehicle? How can we be really, really more creative with all of these things? So that's the space I'm really interested in right now. I don't know where it's going to take me and what that's going to look like. So we should chat again in another couple of years, a year,
absolutely,
3 years, something like that. Yeah. But that's what I'm starting to work on now.
That's so interesting. I just went through a few months ago, kind of the open enrollment process and needing to change benefits. I had a new employer and all the things that come with that. And at the same time, my mom has now retired. My stepdad's on his way. And we were having this whole conversation around how complicated the entire landscape is just in healthcare as a whole, and how there's so much category expansion. It's a little bit of like, where does healthcare stop, or does it really, and should it? And, I think it's going to be very interesting to see where you go and the innovations that you bring out into the world, because this is really an area where I think there's a lot of passion in this country specifically, as well as around the world, around what it evolves to and how it's more accessible, but also it's a way of living, or it becomes a lifestyle and not like an emergency sort of, I need it now because I've really gotten myself into a situation I can't get out of. So I'm excited to see where you get to.
Thank you. And I mean, we could do a whole podcast episode on how I think about the very last bit of what you discussed, which was what is healthcare? Where are the boundaries? I'll share really briefly. For me, everything is healthcare. There is no boundary. Whether it's, I don't believe that profitability and our human health and our environment can be uncoupled from each other. I think it's simply intellectual laziness that's brought us here, and a little bit more effort and not intellectual laziness and channeled investments will get us out of this. So that's what my book is about.
More to come on that. We will definitely do a follow-up episode because I could probably talk about that for an hour also. So very excited. And get the book if that just intrigued you and you want to know more. That's a good plug there. So we end every podcast with guests with a couple of questions. They're easy, I think. So the first one is, what is the worst advice that you ever received?
Oh, that's so easy. The worst, there's plenty of pretty bad advice I've received, but the worst one I'd say is women should not be advocating for their own salaries, and that we should not be asking for a promotion. And therefore, I did not ask for a promotion for 3 years before I thought, this is ridiculous. There were just other factors that made me think, this is ridiculous. And that changed. But yeah, it was a lesson for the rest of my life.
No kidding. That's horrible advice for anybody listening, by the way. Always advocate for yourself. Always ask. The worst thing they can do is say no. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, that was an easy one for you. Okay, so on the flip side then, what was the best advice that you've ever received?
Oh, gosh. I am so lucky. I have great mentors. I have great advisors. But more recently, someone told me to be still and that there was nothing in the world was a pressing emergency that needed to be solved in the next 5 seconds, that I couldn't step away and calm down and really strategically think about how I needed to solve it and whether I needed to be the person that solved it at that moment or not. And I think we need to remember that our power is internal, and need to remember when to harness it externally.
That's such good advice. Just take a minute, be still. I really like that. That's a good way to articulate just kind of, because you still everything. You're physically, you still yourself, you're mentally, you just take a break. Yeah. I could definitely use that advice sometimes too. And it's great that you had somebody in your world that could see that that's exactly what you needed to hear in that moment and encourage you to do that. Because I think we need more people like that around us.
100%.
Now, the last one, maybe this one's a little bit trickier, but you are a mission-driven individual, so probably not. When you get to the end of your life, or even beyond that, when, 2 or 3 generations past you are talking about you, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want them to be saying or remembering about you?
I hope they remember how fun and kind I was. But more importantly, I hope that I'm forgotten, and I hope that so much change has occurred and that the environment is so much better for those individuals that they just consider it the norm and they can't imagine a world in any other way.
That is so powerful. That is so powerful. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I'm sure that everybody did. And we covered so much ground, and I appreciate you sharing your story with us. So that's what we've got today. We're going to, let everybody stream their next podcast. And for my listeners out there, we always end it the same. You are wise and you are capable and you're strong, and I believe in you. And until next time, you can go find Urvashi on LinkedIn. It's the best way to connect, and she will be happy to invite you into her network, and hopefully you become fast friends. Thank you.